was claimed accounted for about half of its length. He claimed it was somewhat like a dragon or prehistoric creature. Sightings continued throughout the years. Immediately, as the newspapers blew up with stories, people set out to try to be the first to photograph the beast. The first alleged photograph was taken in November of 1933 by Hugh Gray, though this was quickly deemed to be a fake, depicting either a Labrador retriever or an otter. Another photograph was taken the following spring by Robert Kenneth Wilson, a local surgeon and gynecologist. This photograph, shown here, known as the surgeon's photograph because of Wilson's desired anonymity, became the most famous piece of evidence for the existence of the monster, and remains famous to this day. However, after extensive examination, it is now recognized as a famous fabrication. Indeed, many years later, it was revealed to be a hoax after all, with the main perpetrator being a man named Marmaduke Wetherell, who had already faked evidence of the monster before. Wilson was merely the one who claimed to have taken the photograph to avoid suspicion. Some individuals were so convinced of the monster's existence that they began to advocate for its protection, fearing hunters. Others, however, including many who had been living near and working on the loch for decades, remained quite doubtful of the presence of any such monsters lurking below. Attention on such things subsided during the war, but the subject became more common again in the 50s. Amid the numerous sighting reports came more photographs, and even videos, many of which were quickly proven or considered quite likely to be hoaxes or misidentifications. One family, on a boat, even claimed to have collided with the monster, causing the grandfather on board so much shock that he had a heart attack. Thankfully, there was some flesh from whatever they hit left on the engine of the boat. This was extremely useful to the search for the Loch Ness Monster, or at least it could have been had the flesh not been scrubbed off from the engine and discarded immediately by a work crew. In 1977, an even clearer picture of the monster was taken by Tony Doc Shields. Remember him from the initial Owlman of Monon incident, which had occurred shortly before this? This is why he earned a suspicious reputation. The monster does, in fact, appear to be yet another hoax in this photograph. Not every event was so easily explainable, however. In 1954, the boat Rival 3 claimed it picked up a large object following the vessel from about 500 feet below on its sonar readings. This event has been left unexplained. It wasn't the first attempt at using sonar to find the animal, and certainly not the last. There have been many more attempts throughout the decades, many being much more complex and thorough, which also have found interesting things. Large, moving masses under the water were observed in many different surveys, such as the ones undertaken by Robert H. Rines, though what exactly these were remains unexplained. Many different things could turn out to be the culprits. Because the water is quite murky, it's often hard to see far below the surface.
Why not? Why L'Eau de Parfum, Yves Saint Laurent?
Because of incidents like these, despite the fact that there is no shortage of hoaxes, science has yet to conclude without a doubt that there is no undiscovered species of large marine animal in Loch Ness. The question not only carries on into this day, but there is an average of 10 reported sightings every year, some of which are occasionally photographed or even recorded and make international news. It's so popular that the animal quickly became a kind of national symbol of Scotland. Naturally, however, we must remember the fact that a situation is unexplained does not vindicate the wildest explanation available. There is a whole list of more rational explanations for what people are seeing. As one would expect, essentially anything large floating in the water could be mistaken for the monster. Mistaken Nessie reports have been attributed to otters, dogs, boats and boat trails, driftwood, drifting peat moss, fish, seals, birds, deer, optical illusions, waves, geologic activity, anything unusual in the water, and oftentimes even usual things that are easily mistaken. It's quite easy for excitement to blind the skeptical eye of many people, and the legend is certainly exciting. However, again, there are other explanations which maintain that people really are seeing something radical, and they're not as wild as one might expect. Most of them anyway. A famous hypothesis is that Nessie, or Nessies, are a remnant species, or at least a descendant of, what are called plesiosaurs. Now, as an amateur fossil hunter and paleontology enjoyer, I find myself compelled to mention that everyone says that this means Nessie could be a dinosaur, but plesiosaurs are technically not dinosaurs. But they did exist at the same time, living from about 200 to 65 million years ago. The thinking is that Nessie could be, as I said, a remnant of these ancient creatures. This hypothesis goes back to the 1900s, when paleontology was really starting to take off and people were curious about what these fossilized creatures were, and if, perhaps, any of them were still around. Recall, of course, Spicer mentioned he thought Nessie could be a prehistoric creature. Indeed, Nessie's description is quite similar to what your average plesiosaur is believed to have looked like, although reported descriptions admittedly vary widely, which is quite important. Some people have even described it as looking like a camel, which walks on all fours. It would not be the first time that a species of animal previously assumed to have been extinct for millions of years was discovered. As I briefly mentioned in the North America video, the coelacanth was also assumed to have gone extinct during the KPG extinction event 66 million years ago, but was found swimming off the coast of South Africa in 1938. That's an intriguing example, but in imperfect comparison. The coelacanth was far less exciting, lived in very far-off regions from where researchers were primarily working, and is not quite as big or radical as what Nessie is claimed to be. There are a number of critical problems with the plesiosaur hypothesis itself, furthermore, such as that plesiosaurs would have to appear frequently since they rose from the water to breathe, there doesn't appear to be enough food in the loch to support a significant population of the beasts, and most importantly, the loch is only 10,000 years old, and the entrance to the ocean is too narrow and shallow for a large beast to cross. So probably not a plesiosaur. But still, perhaps a large sea animal has yet to be discovered. Some have posited that it could be a species of shark native to the northern oceans, such as the Greenlandic shark. Another suggestion is a giant catfish, such as the El's catfish, or the European sea sturgeon, which are often bigger than the average man. Another suggestion is a giant eel, as eels are common in the loch. The problem with that is that Nessie hasn't ever been reported to swim side to side like eels do, and eels generally prefer the bottom of these large bodies of water. But many scientists still claim it remains a viable hypothesis, more viable than the others in fact. Why? Well, in 2018, a DNA analysis of the loch was undertaken by a team from New Zealand which found no presence of sharks, sea sturgeons, catfish, anything reptile, or anything unknown. But there was a heavy DNA presence of eels, as well as amphibians. Although this analysis did not find any DNA of otters or seals either, which are present in the loch, and rare creatures do occasionally wander in from the ocean through the narrow river Ness. Some have speculated that Nessie could, therefore, be a giant undiscovered amphibian, though this explanation still does not take precedence over the many simpler explanations. For now, the Nessie debate continues, and perhaps it will never be solved for certain. It's a bit more likely than many other cryptids reported around the world, but in my personal opinion, the evidence is weaker than that which is presented for the Sasquatch. Whatever Nessie is, though, assuming she is something, she thankfully appears peaceful. But she's not alone. There are multiple lochs and other bodies of water said to harbor Nessie-like creatures as well in Scotland and throughout the British Isles. Some may be myths inspired by the Nessie myth. Others claim they could be members of the same species. And still others say that these creatures are different monsters entirely. Another example lies 70 miles to the west of Loch Ness in Lake Morar. Here too, it is believed by some, a sea monster dwells, called Morag. It's of course less popular than Nessie, but excluding the ambiguous account of St. Columba, sightings appear to be roughly as old. Indeed, sightings of the Morag go back to the late 1800s, and much like Nessie, continue to this day, at times with multiple witnesses. Morag appears to be Nessie's more temperamental sister. One famous encounter in 1969 holds that two men accidentally hit the creature with their boat, causing her to attack them, leading to a brief fight which may have led to her being shot. However, the legend of Morag originally referred to a mermaid-like creature, said to be half human, half fish, and rather beautiful. Her sighting was not desired, however, as it was claimed her appearance was an omen of death, often as a result of drowning. Today, however, Morag refers to a reported creature more along the lines of Nessie. Finally, we return 600 miles south to Cornwall, to the Falmouth Bay. Some locals claim a creature similar to Nessie lurks here as well, the Morgower, Cornish for sea giant, not to be confused with Morag. The first purported sighting came from a woman named Mary F. in 1976. Mary F. was not the one to report the beast, however, at least to the Falmouth Packet news outlet which reported the story. Rather, the information was sent by a man named Tony Doc... Oh, for goodness sake. The legend, which some claim Shields invented himself, although I'm not making any accusations here, purportedly goes back to the First World War. Shields claims to have sighted it as well in 1976, and even claims to have photographed the beast. In fact, he has even claimed to be able to summon it. It is described as a sea serpent with a long neck and dark skin, being either black or brown. Ever since these initial reports, however, many other witnesses have claimed to have seen the beast, specifically in an area known colloquially as Morgower's Mile. Myths and legends, doubtlessly as old as humanity itself. Perhaps these are all fairy tales, inspired by things like misunderstandings, misidentifications, and the simple fun of making up a good story, and the usefulness that such legends could bring to people, such as discouraging encounters in strange areas with real threats in the world. Or perhaps there is indeed something to at least one of the creatures featured here. Perhaps something quite efficient at evading detection, like Nessie, or something practically unexplainable, whose existence is attributable to forces currently beyond human understanding. Either way, I believe that these stories are important. They are pieces of culture which should continue to be passed down and preserved. I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, I invite you to come check out the rest of Fire of Learning, especially our Campfire playlist, which has more videos on things like cryptids, legendary creatures, as well as holidays, and to subscribe for more videos like this in the future. You can help support the production of videos like these by donating on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. I'd like to thank my current patrons listed here for their support. Fire of Learning is also on Instagram, and I have a science channel called Lucinox, so come check us out there too. Thank you for watching.
Welcome to Flashpoint History, time periods that changed the world. I'd like to thank everybody for listening to this podcast today. This is going to be the first of a three-part series on Attila the Hun. One of the hardest parts to this podcast was to determine exactly where to begin. If you look up Attila online or in any type of book, he's immediately portrayed as this mass-murdering villain, someone who blitzed his way through Europe, razed cities to the ground, murdered countless times. Someone who, if you look him up online, you're going to immediately be blasted by images of one of the most evil men in history, a barbarian, someone that the Roman Catholic Church at the time called Flagellum Dei, the scourge of God. Obviously not the type of person that you want to invite home for dinner. And to some extent, the historical record is accurate. This was, after all, a man who threatened not just the Eastern, but also the Western Roman Empire. He razed cities. He treated life as if it was the lowest common denominator. And now this completely goes against what I was originally planning for this podcast. I was going to start with the idea that the Huns never actually had their own written history, that most of the information that we have on them comes from the Romans, who are obviously not going to portray him in a very good light. And I was hoping to start with something kind of akin to Braveheart, where you talk about how the Huns, under the leadership of Attila, rose from relative obscurity to take on the largest empire of its time, and in the process obtain its own niche in the grand scheme of civilization. What I guess you could call a sense of glory. But this was not going to be a Braveheart story. There was no heroic, noble character, and kind of sad to say, there was no beautiful French princess for him to fall in love with. However, the more research I did into making this podcast, the more I realized that there was actually a better story there than just kind of what met the eye. This was a story of a large civilization's hubris, the hubris of the Roman Empire. A story of civilization versus the nomad, Rome versus the barbarian. This turned out to be a story about what happens when a civilization becomes overextended and whose decline is so profound that it allows for the rise of men like Attila. It's kind of like that old adage, nature abhors a vacuum. And in this situation, it's very true. So with this, I think the place that we need to begin is with the late Roman Empire. For those of you out there that want to hear about the blitzkrieg that I had mentioned earlier through Europe, you're going to have to wait till the second part of this podcast. But I recommend you listen to how this developed and keep those themes that I had mentioned in mind as we kind of go along. And so what was the late Roman Empire truly like? Because this no longer was the empire that was established by Julius Caesar and consolidated under the rule of Caesar Augustus, nor was it the empire that was expanded under emperors such as Trajan, Hadrian, or even Marcus Aurelius. This was a Roman Empire of the 4th and 5th century, a civilization that was in decline. I personally like to make comparisons to the Roman Empire to the German Wehrmacht in World War II. It was no longer a blitzkrieging, fast-moving, all-conquering civilization, but rather one that had developed fortifications, that was surrounded by enemies, and was rife with internal dissent. Now, first and foremost, the Roman Empire was no longer under the command of one particular emperor. Under the reign of an emperor by the name of Diocletian in the late part of the 3rd century, early part of the 4th century, the Roman Empire had come under the governance of 2 co-emperors, Diocletian and Maximian, and they adopted sons who would be considered Augusti. And so this was a time period where you had literally 4 people running the empire, or what they would call the tetrarchy. And so with this division in leadership, you also had a physical division of the actual empire itself. The Eastern Roman Empire, which later historians would call the Byzantine, consisted of places like Greece, Egypt, Asia Minor, the Middle East, whereas the Western Roman Empire would consist of Gaul, which is France, England, and Spain. And the original idea was that all of these realms were to help one another in times of crisis. But in actuality, what you had was the perfect recipe for civil war, which became an endemic part of Roman life from that period onwards. Now, with any type of power struggle, there's always going to be one that is going to slowly claw their way to the top. And in this situation, a man by the name of Constantine, who will later be known to historians as Constantine the Great, and this is a man that probably deserves an entire podcast unto himself, but he came to power. He fought against his rivals. In the year 312, on October 28th, he fought a battle called the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, which he was able to win. But the interesting aspect of this battle was that just prior to this battle, he had a vision where he saw the Christian symbol, the chi in the row, kind of like a P with an X through it. This presented itself to him, and he was told by a voice, in hoc signo vinces, which I'm probably murdering this Latin, but it means, in this sign you will conquer. And so he told all of his soldiers to paint that symbol on their shields. And even though they were outnumbered, they marched into battle and they won. And of course, this sets into motion a series of events which will cause another profound shift in the Roman Empire as Christianity slowly becomes into the limelight. And indeed, the year 313, Constantine passes the Edict of Milan, which grants Christianity official recognition. In 321, Sunday is identified as the official rest day. And between May 12th and June 19th of 325, the Council of Nicaea was held to establish a formal creed for all Christians to believe in. But Constantine also does something which causes yet another profound shift in the Roman Empire. He moves the capital. He establishes the city of Constantinople in the year 330 AD. And he establishes the city on an area called the Hellespont, which is an area of land that sticks out into the Bosphorus. It's surrounded by water. It's extremely defensible territory. It's on the edge of Europe and Asia. And it becomes not only the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, but it becomes a city that will preserve knowledge and Western civilization for the next 1,000 years. And so the Roman Empire becomes fragmented. You have two capitals. And by the way, going back to Rome, it no longer was really a capital. Milan became much more important, and eventually Ravenna took that role. Whereas Rome became, as Christopher Kelly wrote in his book, The End of Empire, a crumbling mausoleum. It became a boneyard of temples and triumphant arches and a relic of former glory. And this divided late Roman Empire was no longer truly expanding. It was surrounded by enemies. The Persian Empire, which had kind of waxed and waned in power, had started assuming its dominance of the Middle East. And instead of leading campaigns of conquest, like if you read back about Julius Caesar taking over Gaul, the Romans had now adopted a policy of building fixed fortifications, which of course was nothing really new. The Romans always had fortifications as they went along. The cities all had walls, but at this point the Rhine River Valley had a series of walls. The Danube had a series of fortifications. If you go to England and you go to the border of Scotland, you can see the remnants of Hadrian's Wall, which was built to keep out the northern barbarians. And to be perfectly fair, the Romans did have a couple of series of reconquests of their former empire when they lost territory to other civilizations. But as a whole, the civilization was starting its slow and gradual decline. Behind these aforementioned fortifications were lands that were filled with nomadic and semi-nomadic people that were slowly coming together and becoming organized, and they were posing more and more of a threat to Rome itself. Now, in most situations up until this time period, if there was any major threat to the borders of the Roman Empire, usually the Romans could assemble an army and send it into place and neutralize whatever type of threat was out there. But it was coming to a time period where internal dissension and the division of the empire, along with the emergence of Persia and increasing barbarian hordes, were no longer something that Rome could easily contend with. And it is into this world that we begin to hear about people such as the Vandals, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Vikings, and eventually the Huns. Now, as I mentioned to you before, the Huns never had their own written history. A good deal of what we know of the Huns actually comes from the Romans. And I'd like to start by giving you a quote from that time period. And when you listen to this, I think this is going to be a quote that really will appeal to the cynics in the audience because it doesn't come across necessarily as just history. It comes across as propaganda. This is a quote from a man by the name of Ammianus Marcellinus. And again, I'm probably getting that name wrong, but in any case, he was a soldier and he was a historian, and he gives one of the best accounts of the Huns. And I quote, "The Huns exceeded any definition of savagery. Although the Huns have the shape, albeit repellent, of human beings, they are so wild in their way of life they have no need of fire or pleasant-tasting food, but eat the roots of uncultivated plants and the half-raw flesh of all sorts of animals. Huns are never sheltered by buildings. Not even a hut thatched with reeds can be found among them. Rather, the Huns roam freely in the mountains and woods, learning from their earliest childhood to endure freezing cold, hunger, and thirst. They wear garments made of linen or stitched together from the pelts of mice found in the wild. Once they have put on a tunic, it is not changed or even taken off until it has been reduced to tatters by a long process of decay and falls apart bit by bit. The Huns are not subject to the direction of a king, but are satisfied with the improvised leadership of their chief men, and batter their way through anything in their path. In agreeing truces, they are faithless and fickle, swaying from side to side in every breeze. Like unthinking animals, they are completely ignorant of the difference between right and wrong. They burn with an unquenchable lust for gold, and are so capricious and quick to anger that often, without any provocation, they quarrel with their allies more than once on the same day. Fired with an overwhelming desire for seizing the property of others, these swift-moving, ungovernable people make their destructive way amid the pillage and slaughter of those who live around them." End quote. This sounds like very bad journalism, very one-sided. Sounds like the purpose of this is not necessarily to give a history, but to demonize someone in order to make that person easier to subdue and kill. But with any history, there is always some degree of truth in what is being said. Marcellinus also goes on to talk about the Huns, and I quote, "Huns are not well adapted to battle on foot, but are almost glued to their horses, which are certainly hardy, but also ugly. From their horses by day and night they buy, sell, eat, and drink. Slumped over their horses' narrow necks, they relax into a deep sleep. No one in their country ever plows. Like refugees, all without permanent settlement, homes, law, or a fixed way of life, they are always on the move with their wagons in which they live." End quote. Now remember what I had mentioned earlier about one of the motifs of this talk was this concept of civilization versus the nomad. And again, in this last quote, Marcellinus mentions those qualities which he feels are the redeeming quality of Rome, the idea of civilization and fixed settlement, the idea of Roman law, and that it was ubiquitous. And what's more, it was something that could be brought to uncivilized people, quote unquote, in order to enlighten them. And it is this that he uses as the yardstick for which he compares all of these barbarians. And in my opinion, I think this represents a certain degree of hubris. Because as these barbarians make further and further inroads into Roman territory, it becomes harder and harder for the Romans to justify their defeat to these people who they otherwise thought of as being inferior to themselves. Now, historians and anthropologists have looked into the world of the Hun to try to figure out exactly what their side of the story was. And again, unfortunately, there's not that much information there. The general consensus from what I could find was that the Huns were a group of people that came from the Asiatic steppe, which was east of the Volga River. They were people that were especially blessed with the ability to ride horses and to use the composite bow in order to attack their enemies with lightning speed and then disappear into the wilderness. Their original homeland is not very well known. Different historians come up with different ideas. Some have even mentioned that they were possibly even Mongolian in origin, that they came from a group of people known as the Xiongnu, which fought against the Han Empire in China. Others feel that their homeland was in present-day Kazakhstan. But I think the real question is, why did they leave? And unfortunately, I don't think we're going to get a good answer to that. But if there's any of you out there that have a good explanation for this, please, by all means, let me know. I'd love to hear from you on this. Now, let's go back to the late Roman Empire. Again, it's divided up into multiple fragments. You have emperors in the east, emperors in the west. Rome is no longer that big of a city as it once was. Christianity is gaining a strong foothold, and fortifications along various areas in the Roman Empire are starting to come under siege. The initial story of the Huns plays out like some sort of space opera. You have this mighty civilization, the Roman Empire with its imperial cities. You have these barbarian hordes kind of on the fringes that are pushing their boundaries, and yet they're all fleeing from something that was horrible and dark on the horizon, that it's slowly making its way westward. Up until the year 370, there aren't that many reports of Huns whatsoever. What you have are all these other groups, people like the Vandals and the Visigoths, that are trying to get away from another entity. And as they make their way west, they are fleeing into the Roman Empire. Our story truly begins on the banks of the Danube River. Now, for those of you who have traveled to Europe, it's probably one of the largest rivers in the world. Its fast-moving waters provide a natural barrier, and it's this that the Romans use as their northern boundary. They set up various fortifications, they patrol it, they even have ships that go up and down to protect their territory and prevent people from crossing. It's onto these banks that a man by the name of Fritigern arrives. Now, Fritigern isn't by himself. He is the leader of a group of people known as the Trevengi, which is a group of Goths. He arrives on the banks in the year 376 with approximately 80,000 people, and they're all fleeing. They're all running away. They had come under pressure from the Huns. They were refugees, and they literally had no other place to go. Now, the Emperor of the East, of Constantinople, of the Eastern Roman Empire, was a man by the name of Valens. And in 376, Fritigern and Valen come to an arrangement. The Goths are allowed passage into the Roman Empire. Now, on paper, this makes complete and total sense to Valens. He has people that he can settle, that can work the fields, that he can tax. And if needed, he has manpower in which he can draft into the Roman army. Now, as a side note, when I was in school, my history teachers would always say that one of the marks of decline in a civilization is when that civilization starts using mercenary forces in order to defend itself. I would say this point is up for debate, but I personally can see the truth behind it. In any case, the Romans, in their attempt to bring these 80,000 people across the Danube, is a process that is immediately botched by Valens' subordinates. For a civilization that was renowned for its efficiency and for its ability to get the job done, I feel that there may be a certain degree of prejudice from the Romans towards these barbarians. Again, this Roman hubris that contributed to this poor maneuver. Now, let me give you an account of exactly what I mean. Again, I'm going back to Christopher Kelly's The End of Empire, who gives a very dramatic account of this crossing. And I quote, "For several days and nights, the Trevengi were ferried across the Danube at one of its narrowest points, near the garrison town of Durostorum, 60 miles west of the Black Sea. This was a dangerous operation made more difficult by the fast-flowing river, still swollen by spring rains. Many Trovinghi, frustrated by the slow progress and distrustful of Roman military supervision, ventured across in canoes made from hollowed-out logs. The most desperate decided to swim. Some were drowned when overcrowded rafts capsized. Darkness brought only greater confusion. The shouts of terrified families separated in the crush to board the boats, the wash of dead bodies against the bank, and the harsh orders barked by unsympathetic soldiers. The situation was way beyond the Roman commander on the frontier. Without warning, he was faced with 80,000 refugees crammed together in makeshift camp. The overflowing latrine trenches threatened an outbreak of disease. The stench drifted into nearby Durastorum. Half-starved Goths crowded around the grain wagons, whose infrequent deliveries were made under heavy guard. Some paid huge sums of food on the black market. Others were able to buy dog meat only by selling their children as slaves. The going rate was said to be 1 child for each dog. End quote. The Romans, of course, don't end here. The treatment of the Goths becomes a subject for debate, but they are essentially reduced to the level of slaves. They're denied weapons, they're given almost starvation rations, and shortly after the aforementioned crossing, Roman soldiers invite the leaders of the Goths to come and talk, at which point they attempt to have them assassinated. Now, they're not entirely successful. Fritigern manages to escape, and this turns out to be one of the biggest mistakes that the Eastern Roman Empire would make. Again, this kind of brings to mind that beginning scene of Braveheart where the leaders of the Scottish tribes were all hung in the barn. For those of you who haven't seen the movie, I recommend it. It's not exactly historically accurate, but it does kind of set the mood for what I'm talking about. Now, as it turns out, Fritigern is not just a leader of his people. He is also a very skilled politician, and he is a keen strategist. He starts to gather his people together and starts training them to become a fighting force. He then